Save your prayers. God is not here with us now. There is only the darkness here. And your death.
Hey, I'm Ferrett Steinmetz. I'm a blogger, I'm an author. I got my new book out, Flex. It's just out now from Angry Robot Press. I'm here to talk. So the central concept of Flex is that basically magic is based on obsession. And the way magic works in the world of Flex is if you are a crazy cat lady and you have a house stuffed with your kitties and you love those little fur balls just enough, eventually you can cross the moral event horizon and start doing crazy cat lady magic. You become a philomancer. And the problem with that is by the time you actually activate your magic, you are full fucking crazy. And you only do magic that helps protect your cats and helps expand your cat-centered pocket empire. And in the middle of all this, there is a bureaucromancer, a guy who loves the DMV. He's fallen in love with the power of paperwork. And he can do amazing stuff. He can basically fill out a valid warrant, drop it on somebody's desk magically, and send a SWAT team crashing through your door. And he's got all of these crazy powers, but he hasn't mastered them. So when his daughter gets burned horribly in a fire, and it turns out he's not actually talented enough to get her the surgery that she needs, for various reasons that chain into each other in the book, he has to take up magical drug dealing. And he turns out to be really exceptionally good at brewing up magical drugs. And if you're wondering how bureaucramancy and paperwork would help you at brewing up drugs, it turns out it's actually really relevant for creating a good drug empire. Where a lot of Flex comes from, it's actually twofold. One, I had a sister-in-law who had a hideously degenerative disease. It was really rare at the time, and at the time it didn't even have a Wikipedia entry. And the insurance companies fucked her over every way that they possibly could. She was on the verge of dying. It was a rare thing, and basically they screwed us over on paperwork on every way. We'd fill out a form that they sent us, and they would reject it for being the wrong form. They would basically screw her over on her medications until she was on the brink of dying, and the insurance company was literally trying to kill her, hoping that she would die before they would shell out $250,000 for the surgery that she desperately needed. So a lot of Flex is really directly related from the struggles that we went through, the emotional process of trying to save our sister-in-law from all of these hideous insurance companies. But also Flex is really seriously about the challenges of being a parent. Because I'm a writer, it took me 25 years to get my first book published. I wasn't very good at writing when I started out, but I refused to give up, and in many ways my obsession is why I've got a book which people are talking well of now. But the central struggle of Flex, if you will, is that you have this man who is thoroughly obsessed with his magic. He loves filling out paperwork. He loves doing all this wonderful stuff. He loves the idea of bending physics and being so wonderful that he can like change the path of the way things should go. But on the other hand, he's got his kid. And he's got his daughter back home. And can he be an actual parent? Can he actually raise his daughter correctly and be a good parent to her while he is still sort of full bull goose loony trying to deal with all of his magic? And that's one of the central aspects of struggle, which is, can you be obsessed with something and be a decent parent at all? In the process of writing, I say that I've written for 25 years, and I have. And in that process, I've written 7 novels that didn't get published. They sucked, and I wrote time and time again, and like I had all sorts of hideously terrible rejections going on. I would pour years of my time into this novel and have it rejected by every agent I sent it to. I would pour all of this energy and heart into stuff that I thought was going to be commercially successful, and it turns out nobody freaking wanted to read it. And the only way that I managed to sell it was when I gave up hope. And that is the weird thing about Flex, which is the #1 question I get asked about Flex, which is a weird question, is why do you talk so much about donuts? Because in Flex, there's a guy who basically is obsessed with donuts and does personality projections based on what kind of donut you like. And my friends and like fans have asked, why so much donuts? I'm like, this is a novel where I gave up hope. I like donuts. I didn't write like the sweeping fantasy epic. I didn't write the love triangle that I thought would sell. This is the one where I'm just like, fuck it. I'm going to write about donuts, and I like donuts, and I like bureaucracy, and I like video games, and I like crazy magic, and I'm just going to stuff all that into a novel. And of course, after 25 years, that's the one that sells. So go figure, you know. I was always a fantasy writer. Of those 7 novels, like, one was a book which I called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Afterlife. That's not the actual name of it, but that was the pitch. And it's actually pretty good, but I wrote it really terribly when I was like 20, so that didn't count. I wrote a sweeping epic trilogy fantasy, which was kind of by the numbers, and it had all these planned things, and I realized it lacked heart. I wrote a fantasy series about dwarves living in a mountain, and basically a reversal where the princess went and got herself kidnapped by the dragon. And again, I didn't have the writing chops to pull that off. And all these things, they had elements where I was sort of sitting there going, well, what do people want? You know, so I'd put in a love triangle, or I'd put in a dragon because people like dragons. And they're not bad novels. I might go back and try to like rewrite them at some point. But the truth was that for so many years, I was writing to try to please other people. And it's only when I finally just said, I'm going to please myself, that ironically things have caught on. So, and what's really important to me about Flex is, like I said, I'd written all of this stuff about, you know, like I said, love triangles, or, you know, these gigantic political things. And what I really wanted to tell was the story of a father and his daughter, because I didn't see a lot of that in any sort of commercial fiction. And one of the things that struck me about fantasy in general is I was on a panel at one point, and somebody asked, so how many adventures are there with parents and kids? Like, you know, not just, you know, the kid gets stuck at home while the parents go off on an adventure, or the kid gets kidnapped and the parents have to, you know, go rescue them. How many adventures are there where you have somebody who's out there kicking ass in Fantasyland and still has to be a parent and come home and read bedtime stories at the end of the day? And those books may exist, but at the time on the panel, nobody could think of any. And so I was like, I want to write a book where it's a father who has all of these adventures and yet needs to be a good parent at the end of the day. And so I gave him a situation where he was forced to determine what sort of man he was and what sort of father he was, and that's really what Flex is all about. There are lines I won't cross in my fiction, but they're mostly because I find they're boring. There's a lot of rape in, you know, fantasy and science fiction, and I'm not opposed to rape, which is a weird thing to say, but I trust you're all on the same page here. Like, but as a trope, it's just been used so many times, and basically I used to joke that women in stories had 2 purposes. They could either give birth or they could get raped, and those were the 2 character arcs they had. And so I just fucking got bored of that so much. So in Flex, there is a woman who I tried to write who was everything I saw in my life that other people didn't have in their books. As an example, like the women that I tend to be attracted to tend to be what are called in trade as big, beautiful women, or, you know, chunky or pudgy or whatever you want to call them. There's no way of referring to them in a way that doesn't come off as negative, because society fucking hates fat women. And even the word fat comes off as an insult, even if you're just trying to use it as a descriptor. So in Flex, there is an overweight woman who is a video game mancer. She is openly kinky. She is alternative, and she has her own plot line, and she has her own motivations, and she has her own dynamics, and that's what I went for. There's nothing I won't write about in my fiction, but a lot of the stuff that is so supposedly taboo in fiction turns out to be the stuff that other people have done so many times that it's lost all shock value. And I would by far rather mind something that's new than go after, it's like, oh, we're going to write another horror story that's secretly about abortion. I'm like, we've seen those 50 billion times before. You're not shocking anymore. Incest isn't shocking anymore. What can we make that's actually genuinely horrifying, you know? I've tried to look outside the box a lot when it comes to my writing. Actually, one of the most valuable lessons I ever had is for about a year, I came up with what I thought was a really kick-ass idea, and I'm like, oh, it's marketable. Because again, you know, it's marketable seems to be like my Waterloo in terms of just like throwing all my effort down the toilet. But I wrote a book that basically the pitch was Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets Edward from Twilight. And what happens when a kick-ass girl finds out that her friend is dating this 120-year-old vampire. And I tried to write that book for like a year, and I had it plotted out, and it was kind of an exciting book. And the truth was that when I went to go write this, I couldn't sympathize with the characters. And that was a really good book for me to not write, which is a weird thing to say. But I'm glad that book collapsed, because what it taught me is I can't write a book unless I am fully sympathetic with all the characters. And I could be sympathetic with a girl who wanted to date a vampire. I could be sympathetic with a girl who was terrified because her friend was dating this hideous bloodsucker. I could find no way within myself to figure out why a 120-year-old vampire would be interested in a 15-year-old kid from a backwater school. And so when that fell apart, that actually turned out to be a really good lesson for Flex, because every character in it, I'm not claiming they're perfect, but at least I feel like I know them, and I feel like I sympathize with them, and I feel like I would be able to sit down with them for a beer and at least get along with them, even the most horrible, blackest villains in this piece. So the lesson I learned from all that stuff is, yeah, whenever I try to write to the box, I can do it, but I've got to find out where my personal heart for it comes from. So I don't know if you have to be flawed to be a good author. I was having this discussion last night when I was out on a date, and one of the things that came up is that I actually had a really idyllic childhood, which some days I wonder if that's not actually a flaw in a writer, because I don't get dysfunctional that well. I don't think you have to be flawed as a writer, but I think you have to be able to look around you and see those flaws. I don't experience a lot of the issues that a lot of the other people do. Like, for example, I am polyamorous. I'm openly kinky. I have all of these hobbies which society considers pretty fucking psychotic. And I actually don't get a lot of shit for it. It's amazing, because I come from a very supportive community in Cleveland where I have a lot of friends. I have an internet, I don't even want to say fan base. I have like 4,000 friends on the internet who are all aware of who I am, and they all are supportive of my severe blackened depression. But I know of people who are in situations who don't have that. I live in a very bubbled world where it's okay to be gay, but I am certainly aware of having other friends who live, say, in Indiana right now, where it's not necessarily as cool. So I guess as an author, if you want to be, you don't have to necessarily be fractured from the background, but you have to be aware of something outside of your own existence. And you have to be able to not just look at that and go, huh, that happens, but you have to be able to put your head into that area and go, if that was going to happen to me, how would I actually feel about that? And work about that down to the level of, if you're gay and you are trying to pick up somebody, how does that feel when you're walking into a cafe where you know it's not cool and you're trying to figure out who's gay and who's not? And I have a lot of friends who have talked to me about that ability, and I'm writing a book right now where the lead character is gay. And I'm not saying I'm going to get it right. I'm probably going to fuck it up a lot. Sorry, gay people. But I'm going to get it as far right as I can, because being able to look at other people's experiences is a critical aspect for an author. So I don't actually find a lot disappointing in terms of what is out there on the shelves right now. Mainly because I think one of the most important things you can do as any kind of fan of media or anything you consume is realizing when stuff is not for you. The best example I can give right now is a friend of mine and I were talking about Cinderella, the new Cinderella movie. And she was saying it had a lot of dress porn in there. Basically Cinderella would put on a dress and the camera would sort of swirl around her and do all of this, focus on the beautiful dresses. And she's like, that one didn't really appeal to me. I thought it was a good movie. There was a lot of focus on the dresses. But this movie was made to appease to 8-year-old girls, not to me. And I think a lot of the stress of fandom comes from this sort of egotistic idea that everything that gets put out must be somehow meant for your heart. And, there are a lot of people who are, going to read Flex and they're going to go, I don't want to read this. This is crap. But the truth is, it wasn't written for you. And there's a lot of stuff which I consider to be crap, but it's not necessarily crap. It just means that it was not made for the audience of me. Which is not to say there's not a lot of problematic stuff out there. I mean, certainly there's a lot of Islamic hating and homophobe hating and all of that stuff and anti-religious stuff. I'm personally religious. I think there's a lot of religion bashing. But a lot of the stuff that gets made out of there, if fandoms could just realize that they weren't making this to please you. They were making it to please these people over here. And yeah, maybe you think it's crap, and you are perfectly right to think it's crap, but you have to come to the ultimate realization that not everything in this world is going to be made to please you, and that's okay. So the one thing that's really, really weird about Flex for me is how people interpret it. And as an author, you can only write what you put on the page, and then you put it out there, and other people do stuff with it. And, you know, you see that in Harry Potter fandoms where, like, you know, J.K. Rowling wrote 7 books, and suddenly there's fan fiction communities galore and fan theories and cosplay and, you know, all this other stuff, and it's wonderful. But the weirdest thing of Flex for me is, like I said, I wrote it for myself, and I have people writing in expressing themes that I didn't even know were in the book, which reflect deeply who I am. Which I'll give you 2 examples, which neither of which are particularly spoiler heavy. The one thing that comes up is that in the world of Flex, there is a scene which is the scene that I've been reading out loud. There's actually an audio production of it online at Podcastle. You can hear the sample chapter if you want to go there. But there's a scene where they make magical drugs. And the way they make magical drugs, a friend of mine texted me and said, wow, it's funny. You have all of this theme here because what you do is you have these mancers, and you have a bureaucramancer, and you have a video game mancer, and they're both deeply into their passion. And the only way they can make drugs is literally to strip all of the interesting stuff out of this, leave yourself with just raw magic, which they hand to boring people to make their lives more exciting. And I'm like, wow, that's actually a firmly anti-drug message. And it's close to what I believe, because I believe people can do drugs, but I certainly don't get any pleasure from it. And then I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that's actually a thing. So that was actually kind of a shock to me, that my philosophy was expressed, but I didn't understand that I was expressing my philosophy. And the other thing, as you can tell, I'm kind of a pasty motherfucker. This sunlight here is coming through the window is burning me. I'm not used to, like, you know, my idea of the outdoors is it's sort of this inconvenient place between air-conditioned places I can get to. And so I have a bureaucramancer and I have a video game mancer, and they are going up against somebody who believes very firmly in the power of nature. I'm trying not to give spoilers away, but a person wrote to me and said, you know, it's funny that you wrote an entire book where basically good indoor people battle the evil outdoor people. And I was like, yeah, actually, that is the way I feel about nature, but I didn't expect that either. So again, you know, writing a book, you discover all sorts of things that you're putting into the book that you had no idea until strangers start noticing themes that reflect who you are, but you didn't know they reflected who you were. So there's a lot of horror in horror, not horrors. There's a lot of horror in what I write in my books. And a lot of that is inspired by real world stuff, but the interesting stuff is how it translates into fiction. And I don't do a direct analog, but I'll give you an example from the book that I'm working on right now, which is the sequel to Flex. And in the sequel to Flex, which is called The Flux, it's due out in October. Oh my God, it's 6 months after the release of this book. But one of the things that is central about that is in the world of Flex, magic is illegal because it has huge backlash, and merely doing magic can lead to out of control things. And in fact, all of Europe got destroyed in the world of Flex at some point, thanks to a magical thing that spiraled out of control. Side note, if you casually destroy Europe in your books without thinking about it, you're going to get a lot of pissed off letters from your European friends going, you killed my hometown. I'm like, okay, sorry. But in the second book, there is a mancer, a magician, who basically creates a haven, a very illegal haven for all of these magic users. And things go horribly wrong because he's not really a good guy. Spoilers. And what I realized, interestingly enough, is that I got all the way through this, and I was all the way through the 4th draft of this book before I finally realized that what I was doing is taking the horrors of the kink community and writing them into a book. And the reason that it is similar, in case you're not familiar with the kink community, is that if you go to somebody's house and you agree to get tied up and you agree to get naked and you agree to get beaten, but not to have sex, and then some guy rapes you, there is no police officer and no court in all the land that is going to help you with that. There is no ability for anybody to really understand this. In fact, in general, if you express that you have kink in your life in courts, you can get your kids taken away from you, and no question. And so what you're seeing in the kink community is, of course, there are these monstrous abuses because there are people in positions of power who are not overlooked by anybody who has any legal authority, and there is more abuse going on in the kink community than I would like to see. Which is not to say that the kink community composes entirely of this, but there's a lot of sort of fucked up fiefdoms from, you know, these people who have created these cults of personality and abuse people who come in, and there's this sort of cycle of abuse where, you know, you get into the community, you immediately figure out who all the skeezy people are and leave, except some people don't get that notification and get very badly hurt. And what I realized is that for The Flux, which is, again, the sequel to this book, that's not in this book, what I was doing was unconsciously regurgitating all the horrors that I'd seen over and over again and translating them into a different horror that was a little bit more understandable based on the world. So a lot of what I see in Flex is very much a reaction to the horrors of the insurance industry, which I dealt with my sister-in-law. And Flux is very much about the horrors of the kink community, but neither of the books directly deal with that. They just sort of take that and put it sideways. Which I don't know if it makes it easier or worse for people to understand how that works, but I think it does make for effective fiction.